It starts with a shaky phone clip sliding through the dark corners of the net, showing masked dudes dragging two tied-up victims inside a garage, and the screaming gets chopped by laughter in the background like the whole thing was entertainment for the crew. Nobody really knew who was behind it at first, but in Quebec, whispers spread fast, and people already suspected a young boss who decided rules were just for the weak. This wasn't no regular beef. This was a street kid poking at giants, trying to shake up the order that had been solid for decades, and the whole province was about to feel the quake. Back in the mid-90s, Quebec wasn't no calm place when it came to the streets, because the biker war between the Hells Angels and the Rock Machine turned the province into one of the deadliest battlegrounds in North America. For real, between 1994 and 2002, over 150 people got killed in that conflict, with bombs blowing up cars, drive-by shootings in quiet neighborhoods, and even innocent civilians getting caught up in the madness. The Hells Angels came out that war on top, led by Maurice "Mom" Boucher, and they straight up crushed the Rock Machine until the group was basically erased from Quebec. Once the Rock Machine was gone, the Hells locked down the streets like a cartel, controlling cocaine, meth, and every corner where drug money could be made. Anybody trying to hustle on their turf had to pay what was called the street tax, which was 10% of everything you earned or else you were done for. That 10% wasn't just some random rule. It was enforced by fear, and dudes knew if you didn't pay up, you were risking your life or your family's life. The Angels had support clubs all across the province, smaller biker gangs like the Evil Ones and the Red Devils, who acted like soldiers making sure no street dealer got too bold. If you skipped the tax, your house could get firebombed, your car could blow up, or you could just disappear with nobody asking questions. The murder of prison guards, the bombing of businesses, the assassination of rival bosses, all of it was part of the biker war years, and that reputation carried into the 2000s, even after Boucher went to prison in 2002 for ordering hits on correctional officers. The Angels built their empire off that fear, and everybody in Quebec remembered how ruthless they could get when somebody tested their control. Montreal was the big show, with the Italian mafia and the Hells Angels always crossing paths, sometimes working together, sometimes beefing, but always in the headlines. Quebec City, on the other hand, was smaller, quieter, and more of a place where the bikers just ran the local scene without much noise. The police presence in Quebec City wasn't as heavy as Montreal, so the Angels didn't face the same level of constant investigations, but everybody still knew who ran the corners. Independent dealers in Quebec City didn't have much choice in the matter, because if you wanted to move weed, coke, or pills, you either kicked up 10% to the Hells or you risked ending up in a ditch. That tax wasn't optional, it was part of the street code, and people didn't talk about it out loud, but everyone knew what time it was. By the early 2000s, the biker war was over, but the fear never left, because police and media kept reminding the public about how many people had died back in the 90s. You could pick up a newspaper and still see coverage on trials, wiretaps, or some biker clubhouse raid, because the shadow of those years kept hanging over the whole province. Even when the streets seemed calm, the memory of bombs going off in family neighborhoods kept people shook. But the thing about fear is that over time, people get tired of it. And by the early 2020s, you had younger street gangs in Quebec who didn't live through the biker wars the same way their older heads did. They heard about it, but they didn't experience it, so that fear didn't cut as deep for them. To them, the Hells were older dudes riding Harleys, collecting taxes, but not moving with the same energy they had in the 90s. That's where the seeds of rebellion started creeping in, because the younger hustlers felt like they were paying dues to an older generation that wasn't putting in the same kind of work anymore. A lot of those independent dealers felt like they could run their own corners without giving up 10% of everything they made to bikers living off a reputation from decades back. Police reports and crime analysts in Quebec even noticed this shift, pointing out that the Hells' leadership was aging, with many of the most feared names either locked up, dead, or semi-retired, and that made the younger generation start thinking maybe the Angels weren't untouchable anymore. The cracks in the system were small at first, but they were real, and they gave room for somebody bold enough, reckless enough, and violent enough to step in and challenge what had been the law of the streets for 30 years. That somebody ended up being Dave "Pick" Turmel, a kid from Quebec City who didn't come from the biker world at all, but decided he wasn't paying that 10% anymore. And once one person stands up against the tax, it gives every other hustler on the block the idea that maybe they don't have to pay either. That was the danger for the Hells, because the whole structure of their empire depended on the tax flowing up without interruption. Dave Turmel was born sometime around the mid-1990s in Quebec City, and his background was working class, nothing fancy, nothing with privilege attached to it. He didn't come from no famous biker bloodline, and he didn't come from no big mafia family, so he basically came from nothing in the criminal sense. He grew up in a city that had been shaped by the biker wars of the 1990s, where the Hells Angels wiped out the rock machine and took control. People who knew him as a teenager said he had a violent streak that stood out, even compared to other kids around him. Reporters like Felix Seguin later described him as ultra-violent, even in those younger years, when most kids were still figuring life out. Stories from Quebec City paint him as someone who realized early that violence could move faster than respect. If somebody crossed him, it wasn't a conversation. It was usually something brutal that left a lasting message. As he got older, he started building his reputation by surrounding himself with younger street dudes who were also down for extreme violence. These weren't biker recruits. These weren't made guys in some mafia family. These were just local hustlers from different neighborhoods trying to make money. Dave became the center of this group, and the thing that glued everybody together wasn't loyalty or respect. It was fear and control. The group he would later lead carried the name Blood Family Mafia, and that name had already been floating around before his time. Back in 2006, the first version of Blood Family Mafia was put together in Montreal, tied to members of the Haitian community and influenced by the Los Angeles Bloods. That early version didn't last long because its leader, Valdano Toussaint, got deported in 2008, and the group faded after that. But the name lived on, and in Quebec City, a new generation of young hustlers picked it up again. By the time Dave was stepping into the streets, the Blood Family Mafia name had been rebranded under mostly French-Canadian and Haitian-Canadian gangsters around Quebec City and nearby towns. Under Dave's leadership, it turned into something different, something more calculated, something more organized. He stripped away the flashy stuff you would see with bikers, like patches, rides, and clubhouse parades, and replaced it with a tighter, almost cartel-style operation. No rituals, no meetings in biker bars, just money and fear dictating who moved what on the block. The way he moved gave off cartel energy, not biker energy. His crew didn't care about legacy or showing off leather jackets with skulls. They cared about results. Dave made sure his people operated with secrecy, using encrypted phones, rotating safe houses, and making sure paranoia stayed high enough to keep everyone sharp. He kept things small, efficient, and disposable because he knew he didn't need huge numbers to control a city. He had lieutenants who helped him build the gang into something serious. One of them was Rubens Dennis, known as the quiet tactician, somebody who kept a low profile but handled the structure behind the moves. Dennis was instrumental in helping Dave connect drug supply lines and organize operations without attracting too much attention. Another key figure was Al Boivin, who had a reputation for violence and was considered the muscle of the crew. Boivin had been involved in distributing drugs in the Saguenay region, and he was known for using firebombings to send messages. When he switched over to Dave's side, he brought territory and contacts with him, strengthening Blood Family Mafia's position in places like Côte Nord and Saguenay. Around these two, Dave had other names, younger operators who carried out kidnappings, enforced debts, and spread fear in Quebec City's neighborhoods. Nobody felt like they were tied to him through brotherhood because the main thing holding them together was knowing what would happen if they crossed him. His crew didn't need love or respect, they needed fear, and Dave made sure fear stayed the #1 motivator. Dave also understood how to brand violence in a way that left long shadows on the streets. It wasn't random chaos, it was calculated messaging that told everyone watching that Blood Family Mafia wasn't like the others. Victims weren't just killed, they were mutilated, tortured, or left in places where the message would be seen by others. A man could get his ears sliced off, or somebody's house could get set on fire. And it wasn't just about punishing that one person, it was about sending a warning across the city. He made sure brutality became part of the brand, almost like a signature that made people think twice before saying his name out loud. That branding spread through videos too, because his people filmed certain acts of torture and intimidation, and those clips ended up floating around on social media and the dark web. Police later said this was one of the first times in Quebec they saw a gang using that kind of psychological intimidation, almost like the Mexican cartels. Dave wasn't building a crew to be friends or family. He was building a machine where fear replaced trust. He enforced paranoia by making his members change phones constantly, shift stash houses, and avoid leaving digital trails that could be tracked. Every move was coded, every message was encrypted, and everything was disposable. He treated his gang like a corporation of violence, with him sitting at the top like a CEO. His violent image wasn't something that just came from nowhere. In Quebec City, there had always been small gangs operating under biker shadow, but none of them had dared to step up the way Dave did. He grew into the role of a gangster that nobody could ignore. because he didn't just talk about violence, he actually showed it. By his early 20s, he had built a reputation that stretched across Quebec City and beyond, and people started realizing this wasn't just some neighborhood tough guy. He was organized, he was ruthless, and he had people who were willing to carry out orders no matter how bloody they were. His name started popping up in police investigations, in street rumors, and eventually in the news. Authorities began to recognize him as the leader of Blood Family Mafia, and that came with weight because they saw his group wasn't just another small-time clique. They were running territories, collecting profits, and spreading violence in ways that shook the old structure. The whole setup was leaner and more aggressive than the biker system, and that was intentional. Dave wanted no part of traditions. He wanted results, and his strategy was simple: fear over respect, violence over negotiation, secrecy over ceremony. That formula made him one of the most dangerous names in Quebec City before the war with the Hells Angels even officially kicked off. By early 2023, Dave Turmel decided he was done paying the 10% street tax that the Hells Angels forced on every independent hustler in Quebec. That move alone was enough to send shock through the whole underworld because everybody knew refusing the Angels was basically the same as declaring open war. That tax had been the foundation of biker control for decades, and the Hells had crushed anyone who even thought about skipping payments, usually within days. When word started spreading that Dave's crew wasn't paying, people couldn't believe it, and most figured he would be dead before summer. Whispers traveled fast through Quebec City neighborhoods and even in Montreal, with dealers asking how long this young crew could survive. The streets had seen bold talk before, but this was different because Turmel didn't just talk, he kept operating like nothing had changed. Police would later note that this was the exact moment the war began, not because shots were fired, but because the Angels realized someone was actually willing to test them. Quebec City had never seen anything like this since the biker wars of the mid-90s, and the tension was obvious. Not long after he stopped paying, the first warning signs started showing up, and investigators later linked them to retaliation attempts from the biker side. One of the most serious incidents was when Turmel's SUV was found with an explosive device planted underneath. That car bomb was discovered in time before it could blow, and it made people believe the Hells were trying to send him a message. Nobody claimed it publicly, but in Quebec, everybody knew explosives were a biker signature during the 1990s conflict. Around the same period in March 2023, another big name in the underworld was targeted, and that was Leonardo Rizzuto, son of the late Godfather Vito Rizzuto. On March 15, 2023, Leonardo was driving on Highway 440 in Laval when gunmen opened fire on him. He got shot at 6 times while in traffic, but he survived with minor injuries, and the incident immediately sparked rumors about biker involvement. For years, the Hells Angels and the Rizzuto crime family had worked together at times, but their relationship had been breaking down. The attempted assassination was seen by many as a sign that the bikers were ready to move on the mafia too, not just the smaller gangs. For Turmel, this moment was huge because it gave him a chance to link with enemies of the Hells who had serious weight. According to reports from sources close to the streets and journalists like those at Gangster Report, Turmel reached out through intermediaries to connect with the Sicilian Mafia. Leonardo Rizzuto, fresh off his own near-death experience, was more open than ever to new alliances. Insider accounts say the two men cemented some kind of deal, basically agreeing that their organizations had a common enemy in the Hells Angels. The Rizzutos had their problems with biker dominance, and Turmel needed bigger backing to keep pushing forward. The story goes that both men were targeted in the same week, Leonardo with bullets on the highway, and Dave with an explosive planted under his SUV. Whether or not those attempts were connected, the symbolism made the link between them feel natural. Reports say that through a cousin of the Rizzuto family who had contact with Turmel, the young mafia boss and the Blood Family Mafia leader finally communicated. That connection gave Turmel more legitimacy on the streets because he wasn't just some local gangster anymore. If the Sicilian Mafia was really backing him, then suddenly he looked a lot more dangerous, and people started to believe he could actually survive. The Rizzuto family had long been a powerhouse in Montreal, with connections in cocaine supply lines, money laundering, and political influence. Even though Leonardo wasn't his father, having the Rizzuto name linked to you meant something in Quebec. It meant that the Hells weren't just fighting a small gang from Quebec City anymore. They were looking at a wider alliance. The answer from Turmel was blunt and absolute because he sent back word that he wasn't negotiating. The phrase repeated later in underworld chatter was something like, "Go back to Quebec. I didn't come here to negotiate." That refusal stunned many because bikers were used to their demands carrying weight, and few people told a senior member like Auger to leave empty-handed. Auger returned to Quebec with no truce, and the fact that he even tried showed how unusual the moment was. For decades, the Hells had never looked hesitant about dealing with rivals, yet now one of their senior men had flown across the Atlantic seeking dialogue. That hesitation didn't go unnoticed by street-level dealers, who began whispering that the bikers were nervous. After that failure, the situation in Quebec exploded into open violence, and by late summer 2023, it was no longer just threats. Shootings began hitting neighborhoods in Quebec City and nearby towns, with victims tied to both sides of the conflict. Businesses connected to Hell's supporters were hit with Molotov cocktails, leaving store owners shaken and local citizens nervous about walking home at night. Kidnappings became part of the conflict too, with dealers or small associates grabbed off the streets by masked men. Some of these people were beaten, others were disappeared entirely, and their families were left terrified. Police reports started stacking up with complaints of missing persons linked to the drug world, many of which were believed to be tied to the Blood family mafia. At the same time, independent dealers started openly defecting, choosing to align with BFM instead of continuing to pay the Angels. For many of them, the decision wasn't about loyalty, it was about survival and money. If they kept paying the Angels, they risked becoming targets for BFM, and if they stopped paying, they had to trust BFM's protection. In that climate, a lot of hustlers decided it was safer to ride, with the young crew making noise. The effect of all this on everyday people in Quebec City was heavy because the violence wasn't staying hidden in the underworld anymore. Ordinary citizens started waking up to the sound of explosions or shootings happening near their homes. Local media outlets like Journal de Québec began reporting almost weekly on new incidents, calling it a wave of urban violence. In neighborhoods like Lévis, Montmagny, and Beausset, people started whispering about the new gang that dared to take on the Hells Angels. Parents warned their kids about being outside too late, and local businesses worried about getting caught in the crossfire. Even Quebec politicians started acknowledging in interviews that the province looked like it was sliding back toward the days of the biker war. The intimidation, the arsons, the failed truce with Mario Auger, and the kidnappings created an atmosphere where everyone understood this wasn't going to slow down. Dave Turmel and his Blood family mafia had made their position clear, and the bikers, embarrassed by the Portugal incident, were preparing to fight harder. The police knew things were heating up too, because they started noticing a rise in surveillance chatter, coded language on wiretaps, and increased movement of known biker affiliates. Investigators realized that Quebec City had become the center of an escalating battle that was spreading across eastern Quebec. Citizens who lived through the biker wars of the mid-90s recognized the signs, and they knew the city was heading into another dark chapter. The difference this time was that it wasn't one biker gang against another. It was a street gang led by a young, unpredictable leader going head-to-head with Canada's most established outlaw club. By the end of 2023, Quebec wasn't just nervous, it was bracing for what everyone knew was coming. The quiet years were over, the rules were broken, and the war was officially spilling into the streets for real. By late 2023, the streets of Quebec were boiling, and the violence reached a whole new level. The Blood family mafia had already pushed the Hells Angels further than anyone thought possible, but now it was about to get bloodier. On November the 27th, 2023, Michel Dooney-Guerin was outside his house shoveling snow in Quebec City. He was 53 years old, and he wasn't just some random biker associate. He was the chief debt collector for the Hells Angels Quebec City chapter. That job meant he was in charge of making sure money flowed up the chain, and people paid what they owed. That evening, as he cleared his driveway, gunmen rolled up and opened fire, hitting him multiple times in front of his home. The attack was clean, professional, and shocking, because Guerin had been considered untouchable in the Quebec biker scene. Within minutes, he was dead, lying in the snow outside the same house where his family lived. Police and journalists quickly connected the murder to the Blood family mafia because the message was too clear to miss. Killing Guerin wasn't just about removing a debt collector, it was about showing that the Hells Angels could bleed. It signaled that even longtime figures with heavy protection could be reached and taken out. For decades, the Angels had thrived on the idea that their enforcers and collectors were safe from retaliation. Now the streets saw a different picture, one where the bikers could lose their own men in broad daylight. That single assassination badly shook the biker image, and underworld sources admitted it damaged the Angels' reputation. After that killing, the war went from serious to chaotic, and the first months of 2024 showed just how reckless things had become. One of the most infamous incidents was the St. Malachi hostage affair in February 2024. It happened in the rural town of St. Malachi, where a house on Route Kelly turned into the center of a bloody standoff. The plan, according to investigators, was for BFM members to kidnap relatives of Mario "Bananas" Auger, the same senior Hells member who had earlier flown to Portugal. By targeting his nephews, they wanted to pressure the Angels directly, maybe torture family members to send a brutal message. The operation involved several BFM members, including a father-daughter pair named Georges Roy and Marie-Laurence Roy, who owned the house. They lured the targets with a fake meeting, thinking they could overpower them quickly and hold them inside. But instead of a clean operation, chaos exploded inside the house, with guns going off and panic spreading. During the melee, Patrick R.A.V. Martin, a childhood friend of Dave Turmel and one of his lieutenants, ended up dead. Martin was close to Turmel, part of his core circle, and his death hit the crew personally. Some accounts suggest he was shot during the chaos by mistake, while others believe a struggle with the intended victims caused it. Whatever the details, the same Malachi hostage plot ended in disaster, leaving one dead and others critically injured. Police swarmed the scene hours later, finding blood, shell casings, and terrified survivors. But by then, the main perpetrators were already gone. The incident showed how reckless the conflict had become, where even allies could die in poorly executed plans. For Turmel, losing Martin was a serious blow, not only emotionally, but strategically, because Martin had been with him from the beginning. That death proved this war wasn't only hurting the Angels, it was tearing into BFM too. Only days after that mess, another shocking case came to light, one that made headlines across Quebec and even outside Canada. This was the Montmagny torture case, a story that truly exposed the cartel-level brutality of the Blood family mafia. In mid-February 2024, BFM members invited a local dealer to what they called a farewell party. The man had decided he wanted to quit working for BFM, and that choice alone was seen as betrayal. When he showed up, instead of a party, he was taken captive inside a house in Montmagny, a town east of Quebec City. For several days, the victim was tortured in ways that shocked even hardened police officers when they later learned the details. Reports said he was beaten repeatedly, waterboarded multiple times, and his ears were partially cut off as part of the abuse. His feet were burned with fire, and by the time police finally rescued him, he was in critical condition. The individuals arrested for the torture included names like Dave Mathieu, William Monger Gagnon, David Marceau Morin, Evan Lavoie, and Andréane Dominique. Each of them faced charges ranging from kidnapping to aggravated assault to mutilation, and prosecutors later described the entire ordeal as one of the most brutal in recent memory. Journalists covering the case said it reminded them of videos coming from Mexican cartels, not from Quebec. Even criminologist Maria Morani noted that these types of torture methods weren't common in Quebec street gangs. The Montmagny torture case proved that Turmel's crew had adopted a level of violence more extreme than the biker wars of the 1990s. That brutality wasn't hidden in shadows either, because clips of torture had already been surfacing on social media and the dark web. The psychological effect of that exposure was massive, because it showed younger gangs that BFM wasn't just a street crew, they were branding themselves like an international cartel. The violence in early 2024 reached another disturbing level when a teenager got caught in the middle. In February, reports spread that a 14-year-old boy tied loosely to BFM had been intercepted by the Hells Angels. The boy had been carrying an AK-47 rifle and gasoline, and sources said he was about to firebomb a biker clubhouse. According to accounts, he was caught inside a Hells Angels support club property before he could finish the mission. Instead of turning him over to police, the bikers decided to make an example. The boy was executed, his body burned, and then dumped outside another biker-linked location as a gruesome warning. That incident shook even veteran investigators because the victim's age highlighted just how far this war had dragged people. Seeing a burned teenager's body outside a clubhouse left Quebec reeling, and the message was clear. The Angels were not holding back. It showed that anyone, regardless of age, could be targeted if they played a role in Turmel's war. Meanwhile, violent incidents stacked up so fast in early 2024 that police could barely keep up with the reports. Quebec media counted more than 30 different events tied to the war, from firebomb businesses to drive-by shootings and kidnappings. That number was likely lower than the true total, since many street-level acts went unreported. Almost daily, people in Quebec City and surrounding towns woke to news of another fire, another body, or another attack. Local media described it as violences urbaines, urban violence not seen since the biker wars of the mid-90s. Citizens who remembered those days admitted it felt like history repeating itself. except this time the players were different. Bars and nightclubs connected to bikers were hit with Molotov cocktails, and vehicles tied to BFM members were blown apart. Dealers flipped sides under pressure, some choosing BFM for protection, others sticking with the Hells despite the risks. That split created confusion because nobody could tell who was aligned with who anymore. Police said the war had moved from whispers into an outright crisis, with officers forced to respond almost every day. Raids on biker clubhouses increased, and journalists noted that entire neighborhoods felt trapped between two forces fighting for control. Citizens with no ties to crime feared being in the wrong place when the next attack came. The atmosphere in Quebec was thick with fear, because the province had not seen this much bloodshed in decades. The biker wars of the mid-90s had killed over 150 people, and older residents worried this conflict could reach that level again. The difference now was the brutality, because the mutilations, torture, and burned bodies looked more like cartel tactics. By February 2024, Quebec was engulfed in a drug war that seemed impossible to contain. The Blood family mafia had shown they were willing to fight in ways nobody expected. The Hells Angels, pushed and embarrassed, were responding with their own brutality. And the public, stuck in the middle, realized that the streets of Quebec had turned into a battlefield once again. By February 2024, the chaos in Quebec had reached a point where law enforcement couldn't sit back anymore. The fires, the kidnappings, and the killings had pushed the province into a full-scale crisis. Police forces at every level, from the Quebec Provincial Police to the RCMP, were under pressure to stop the bloodshed. That's when they launched one of their biggest operations in years, a coordinated sweep called Project Scandaleux. On February 24, 2024, officers carried out raids across Quebec City, Lévis, Montmagny, and other towns linked to the Blood family mafia. The operation hit stash houses, trap apartments, and businesses tied to BFM activity, catching members by surprise. Within a single week, 21 people were arrested, all connected to the violent turf war gripping the province. Investigators seized firearms, burner phones, encrypted devices, and piles of evidence linking suspects to kidnappings and torture cases. Some of the phones contained messages showing orders being sent from higher-ups, while other items included maps, cash, and weapon stockpiles. Police even uncovered safe houses that had been used for holding victims, with traces of blood and restraints found inside. The list of those arrested read like a who's who of BFM's lower and mid-level ranks. Names like Georges Roy and his daughter Marie-Laurence, already tied to the Saint Malachi affair, were hauled into custody. Others like Dave Mathieu, William Monger Gagnon, and Evan Lavoie, connected to the Montmagny torture case, were arrested and charged. Journal de Québec later published the full roster of suspects, showing just how many players the police managed to snatch at once. Prosecutors wasted no time stacking charges against them, ranging from kidnapping and aggravated assault to gangsterism and attempted murder. Court documents painted a brutal picture, detailing how victims had been waterboarded, mutilated, or threatened with firearms to keep the gang's reputation alive. One prosecutor even compared the case files to scripts from a Narcos series, only this time the setting was Quebec. While those arrests hit the lower levels hard, the bigger blow came from the captures of senior figures who had fled Canada. Police had already issued warrants for several of Turmel's closest lieutenants, but actually finding them abroad was another challenge. That's where international cooperation came in, and Interpol started helping track BFM fugitives across Europe. On February 29, 2024, Portuguese police arrested Rubens Dennis, Turmel's right-hand man, at a hotel in Lisbon. Dennis had been described as the quiet tactician, the brain behind a lot of BFM's drug operations and violent planning. His arrest came after months on the run, and investigators credited a tip combined with wiretap intel for finally pinning him down. Dennis was held in custody awaiting extradition to Canada, and his arrest made headlines across Quebec. Police chiefs openly said this was a major hit against BFM because Dennis wasn't just another soldier, he was a key architect of the crew's structure. Without him, the gang's ability to coordinate complex operations was badly weakened. A few months later, another name from Turmel's circle fell. On June 30th, 2024, the RCMP arrested Guillaume Saint-Louis Bernier in Kelowna, British Columbia. Bernier had been identified as one of BFM's leaders, and his capture showed that even fleeing to the other side of Canada wasn't enough to escape. Like Denis, he was quickly lined up for extradition back to Quebec, where prosecutors were building cases against the entire gang. With Dennis and Bernier out of play, the Blood family mafia's chain of command started to collapse. Police estimated that more than 30 members or associates had been charged by mid-2024, each one facing serious sentences under Canada's organized crime laws. The court documents were damning, with details about mutilations, kidnappings, and violent intimidation spread across multiple cases. Judges and prosecutors highlighted the cruelty, calling it unprecedented for Quebec. Evidence showed how the gang used torture as a branding tool, something more often associated with cartel groups outside Canada. That kind of brutality shocked the courts, and it fueled the push to hand down long sentences. For the first time since the conflict began, the Blood family mafia looked like it was losing momentum. Money dried up because dealers who once stopped paying the Angels began slipping back under biker control, fearing BFM could no longer protect them. With so many members locked up or facing trials, their ability to enforce threats was reduced. Police said the February crackdown slowed the daily violence that had terrorized neighborhoods because foot soldiers were either behind bars or on the run. By March, headlines noted that incidents had decreased, even though the threat wasn't gone completely. Law enforcement celebrated the operation as proof that coordinated pressure could bring results, even against violent new gangs. Still, officials warned that as long as Dave Turmel remained free, the conflict wasn't finished. He was still directing from overseas, sending encrypted messages and rallying what remained of his network. But the fact remained that Project Scandaleux dealt a blow that changed the balance of power. For the Hells Angels, the crackdown was almost a blessing because the police had done much of the work that they couldn't finish themselves. The bikers had suffered major hits, including the death of Guerin, but compared to BFM, they weathered the storm better. By late 2024, journalists like Pascal Robidas were reporting that the Angels were regaining control, while BFM was struggling to keep its rebellion alive. In the courts, case after case piled up, with gruesome testimony from victims and chilling evidence shown to judges. Survivors of kidnappings described being tied up for days, beaten with pipes, or threatened with burning if they didn't comply. One man testified that he had his ears sliced during a session meant to send a message to anyone leaving the gang. Hearing those stories in courtrooms made it clear just how far the Blood family mafia had gone in trying to build their reputation. It also made it easier for prosecutors to argue for stiff sentences, because juries and judges alike saw the cruelty firsthand. By the end of 2024, Quebec officials were claiming that the BFM threat was under control, even though Turmel himself remained a fugitive. They pointed to the 30-plus arrests, the high-profile extradition requests, and the seizures of weapons and communication devices as proof. For everyday people in Quebec, the wave of arsons and shootings slowed enough that they could breathe again, though nobody thought the danger was fully gone. The crackdown didn't end the story, but it marked the first real shift in momentum since the conflict started. For the Blood family mafia, it was the beginning of decline, and for the Hells Angels, it was a chance to regroup and reassert control over their lucrative territories. By the summer of 2023, the heat in Quebec was reaching levels that even Dave Turmel couldn't ignore. Police were circling, the Hells Angels were plotting, and the streets were buzzing with his name every single day. That July, he slipped out of Canada, beginning a run that would last nearly 2 years and stretch across continents. The exact way he left is still unclear, but investigators believe he used fake documents and possible smuggling routes. Some reports suggest he crossed into the United States quietly before taking a flight overseas, while others say he flew directly from Quebec using false identification. Whatever method he used, by July 2023, Turmel had disappeared from Quebec, leaving police and rivals scrambling to find him. Almost immediately, rumors of sightings started spreading across Europe. The first strong lead pointed to Portugal, where he was said to be hiding in Lisbon. That rumor gained strength later when his right-hand man, Rubens Dennis, was arrested there in February 2024. Street sources whispered that Dennis and Turmel had stayed together in Portugal for a time before splitting up. Other reports placed Turmel in Spain, especially in coastal cities where organized crime networks were already active. Spanish authorities later admitted they were on alert for him after tips from Canadian officials. Still, no arrest happened there, and he remained a ghost. By mid-2024, intelligence began suggesting he had moved further south, with whispers saying Morocco or North Africa. Gangster Report even cited sources claiming he was living in a safe house somewhere in North Africa, still giving orders back to Quebec. That claim lined up with reports of encrypted messages being traced to overseas servers during the same months. While on the run, Turmel wasn't just hiding, he was still running the Blood family mafia from afar. Police wiretaps and investigations showed that he relied heavily on encrypted chats to communicate with his people. Burner phones were rotated constantly, with messages sent through layers of intermediaries to avoid detection. One report described him as a CEO of violence, giving orders from across the ocean. Even from thousands of kilometers away, he was deciding who got hit, which businesses got burned, and how money should move. His crew in Quebec treated his word like law, even when he wasn't physically present. The level of control he maintained frustrated Canadian authorities because despite dozens of arrests, incidents kept happening. Fire bombings and shootings in Quebec City and Levi's during March 2024 were believed to have been ordered by Turmel while overseas. Police officials said it was proof that he still had influence, even though his top lieutenants were falling one by one. Being away didn't make him safe because the Hells Angels had their own global connections. Word spread quickly that a bounty had been placed on Turmel's head. Early in 2024, the figure being whispered was $500,000. By later in the year, rumors said the number had doubled to a full million. That kind of bounty made him a marked man anywhere he went because professional hitmen and rival groups had every reason to chase him. The Hells Angels weren't going to forgive him for the damage he caused, especially after Guerin's assassination and the open defiance of their authority. Police officials even warned that bounty hunters might move before law enforcement did. To stay ahead, Turmel had to move constantly, never staying in one city too long. Reports said he used multiple identities, fake passports, and even rented cars under false names. Friends and family in Quebec told reporters they hadn't heard from him directly, only through encrypted video calls. His mother was said to be one of the only relatives who still communicated with him occasionally. Despite the danger, his legend grew the longer he stayed on the run. By late 2024, he wasn't just a local gangster, he had become the top fugitive in all of Canada. In December 2024, the BOLO program, which highlights the country's most wanted criminals, listed him as #1. The announcement came with a reward of $250,000 for information leading to his capture. Media outlets across Canada ran the story, calling him Canada's most wanted fugitive, with lurid details about torture and mutilation tied to his gang. Halifax City News and Global News ran headlines describing him as the embodiment of violence. The BOLO listing wasn't just about offering money, it was about keeping his face and name in the public eye. The campaign used posters, social media, and press conferences to remind Canadians that he was still out there. Officials even compared him to international fugitives, saying his ability to direct violence while overseas made him especially dangerous. Quebec City's police chief, Denis Turcotte, told reporters in December 2024 that Turmel and his associates represented violence itself. He said they encouraged violence in their circles and influenced younger gang members by example. That statement was meant to underline the urgency of catching him before more damage was done. The media campaign had mixed effects. On one hand, it generated tips from people claiming to have seen him in Europe. On the other hand, it fueled his myth as an outlaw who had managed to outsmart everyone. Younger hustlers in Quebec began talking about him like a modern folk hero, even though his actions had caused chaos for entire communities. For police, the challenge was turning tips into solid leads. They received reports of him in Spain, Italy, Morocco, and even South America, but verifying those sightings was difficult. His use of fake identities made it harder, and his ability to disappear quickly kept him a step ahead. By the end of 2024, authorities admitted that despite the high-profile arrests of Denis and Bernier, Turmel remained out of reach. They knew he was still alive, still giving orders, and still moving around overseas. Every day he remained free added to his reputation, but it also kept the streets of Quebec on edge. The combination of the $1 million bounty, the BOLO top ranking, and the $250,000 reward made him one of the most hunted men in Canadian criminal history. He was wanted by police, by rival gangs, and by hitmen hoping to cash in. That pressure meant he couldn't relax for a moment, and his fugitive life was a constant game of survival. By early 2025, the walls were finally closing in on Dave Turmel. He had been on the run since July 2023, dodging police and bounty hunters and rivals, but his movements were starting to leave traces. Investigators in Quebec had been following encrypted messages, burner phones, and bank activity that pointed overseas. Every clue suggested he was still giving orders, and that meant people were watching closely. The key to finding him came from a mix of international tips and digital surveillance. Police in Quebec passed intelligence to Interpol, which then shared it with European law enforcement agencies. By March 2025, Italian authorities had confirmation that Turmel was hiding somewhere in Rome. The breakthrough came when one of his associates slipped up, using a communication line that was already being monitored. Interpol worked closely with Italy's anti-mafia police, who had experience tracking fugitives from organized crime. They began following suspicious movements around Rome, watching villas rented under fake names, and gathering intel on Canadians moving through the city. One of those villas stood out, located just outside the main center of Rome, quiet but clearly fortified. On the night of March 27, 2025, Italian tactical units moved in with precision. Officers surrounded the villa in the early hours, cutting off exits and preparing to breach. When they finally stormed inside, Turmel didn't go out shooting. Instead, he tried one last trick, producing a fake French passport in an attempt to bluff his way out. The passport didn't fool anyone, and within minutes, he surrendered without putting up a fight. Reports later said he was standing barefoot in a hallway when police grabbed him, calm but resigned. For a man who had spent nearly 2 years as Canada's most wanted, the end came surprisingly quietly. Inside the villa, investigators found the tools of a fugitive life. There were multiple fake IDs from different countries, each with his picture but different names. They seized several burner phones, stacks of SIM cards, and encrypted USB drives. Police also discovered handwritten maps detailing stash houses, routes, and names linked to Quebec's drug trade. The evidence painted a clear picture of someone who had been running an international operation. Journalists described it as proof that Turmel was acting like a CEO of violence, coordinating attacks and moves from a safe distance. It wasn't the image of a small-time gangster hiding in basements. It was something more calculated. Authorities also found cash in multiple currencies, suggesting he had been laundering profits and preparing for quick escapes. Italian police told reporters the villa was stocked for someone planning to stay hidden for a long time. Even small details like burner laptops and coded notebooks showed how seriously he took staying off the radar. But arresting him didn't mean the story was over. Turmel was locked inside Rome's Regina news of the Quake arrest broke. It spread fast across Quebec. Headlines in Journal de Québec and Global News announced that Canada's most wanted fugitive was finally caught. Families of victims tied to the Blood family mafia called it a victory, while police held press conferences praising the international cooperation .Lee prison, a historic high-security facility known for holding dangerous criminals. Reports said he was doing okay inside, keeping a low profile and not causing trouble with other inmates. Despite his violent reputation, he wasn't starting fights, instead focusing on his legal defense. His lawyers immediately began fighting extradition, using European laws to delay his return to Canada. Under Italian law, crimes committed on their soil take priority, and prosecutors argued he had broken several local statutes. That included possession of false documents, possible weapons offenses, and suspected drug trafficking links during his stay. The extradition process meant Canada couldn't just bring him back immediately. Instead, they had to submit formal requests and wait for Italy to process them. Legal analysts said the process could take months or even years, depending on appeals. In the meantime, Turmel remained inside Regina Coeli, monitored around the clock. Back in Quebec, prosecutors were preparing thick case files, ready to hit him with charges as soon as he returned. These included leadership of a criminal organization, conspiracy, trafficking, kidnapping, and multiple counties said his trial is tied to violent acts. Author in Canada would be one of the most significant in recent years. For the Hells Angels, his arrest was both relief and unfinished business. Relief because their most dangerous rival was finally out of circulation. Unfinished business because his gang had left scars, and some members still wanted revenge. Street sources said the $1 million bounty wasn't officially canceled, though hitting him in prison would be nearly impossible. In Quebec, everyday people felt some level of closure, knowing the man tied to so much violence was finally locked up. But the sense of calm came with an understanding that his capture didn't erase the damage. His name still carried weight, his crew had not fully disappeared, and the encrypted devices seized in Rome held secrets investigators were still trying to crack. Even in a Roman cell, his legend was growing. The young gangster from Quebec City, who refused to pay the Hells Angels tax, had made it further than anyone expected. His capture ended the chase, but it didn't end the story, because questions still remained about what he built and who else was involved. With Turmel locked in Regina Coeli prison, the streets of Quebec started to shift again. The daily shootings slowed, the firebombings decreased, and for the first time in 2 years, people felt some calm. Dealers who had defected to Blood family mafia slowly drifted back toward the Angels, knowing BFM no longer offered protection. The biker tax was being enforced again, with fewer people daring to resist this time. Police considered the crackdown and capture a success, But they also knew the story wasn't finished. Over 30 BFM members had been charged, and cases were still moving through Quebec courts. Testimony about torture and mutilations shocked juries, leaving little doubt about convictions. Survivors described nights of beatings, kidnappings, and threats, making it clear the gang left permanent scars. Judges handed down stiff sentences, showing no for the Hells Angels. It was a return of their dominance, even if their image was dented. The assassination of Michel Dooney-Guerin, the hostage affair, and other hits reminded everyone they could bleed too. Still, their network remained intact, and with rivals weakened, they moved quickly to reclaim lost corners. By mid-2025, biker affiliates had reasserted themselves in Quebec City, Lévis, and Saguenay. The rebellion that once looked unstoppable was now broken. Sympathy for the defendants standing in front of them. Turmel's legacy remained complicated, with some seeing him as a reckless criminal who caused chaos. Others in Quebec's younger generation saw him as proof that angels could be challenged. His rise from a working-class background to Canada's most wanted fugitive gave him mythic weight. Journalists wrote that his violence branded him as both a monster and a symbol of defiance. His devices seized in Rome still held secrets, possibly linking him to broader networks. Investigators believed the files could expose trafficking routes across Europe, Africa, and South America. Inside prison, Turmel kept silent, offering no statements to media or law enforcement. His lawyers stalled extradition, but Canada continued pressing, determined to try him at home. Extradition battles dragged on, and his trial was likely years away. Meanwhile, the streets of Quebec adapted, with new gangs rising quietly, learning from his playbook. Police admitted the danger hadn't disappeared, only changed shape. They warned that other groups might try similar defiance in the future. For regular people in Quebec, the memory of burned houses, tortured victims, and shootings lingered. The war had cost lives, ruined families, and pulled neighborhoods back into fear. The fragile peace after his capture was welcome, but nobody thought it was permanent. As one resident told a reporter, "When guys like him exist, the peace never lasts long." Turtuk Tohables bleed, but it ended in a Roman prison cell. The streets are quieter now, but the legend of Dave Turmel's story was the kind that blurred myth and reality, making him unforgettable. He had dared stop paying the angels, dared to defy decades of control.